Hello, I'm Hannah, and this is Hannah's Books. After a return from my family's trip to Boston last week, I knew I had to find space on my shelves for all the new books I bought, both those I found at the phenomenal Brattle Bookshop and the couple I picked up at a little free library on the street while my son was inside getting his dorm room bedding out of storage. And I realized that before I put them on my shelves, I ought to tell you a little bit about them. Steve Donahue pointed out that all these books pretty much have my name on them, figuratively at least, but still, there's quite a bit of variety in the choices, I think. So let's go through them. The first book I'll show you is a book I had never heard of, but have already enjoyed quite a bit, Bibliotopia, compiled by Stephen Gilbar. The volume has a great antique-sounding subtitle, Bibliotopia, or Mr. Gilbar's Book of Books and Catch-all of Literary Facts and Curiosities. Fundamentally, this is a book of bookish trivia. Although the book begins with a short little section about the origins of the word book and the invention of paper, and even how many trees it takes to produce 1,000 novellas, much of the volume is made of lists. You can find a long list of authors who went by pseudonyms, including their real names. You could find a list of Academy Award-winning films based on novels. There are also instructions on how to pronounce names we might see as tricky, and a list of similes used by Edith Wharton, and the names of authors who attended colleges associated with particular athletic conferences. In general, the book is in pristine condition, but its previous authors placed check marks next to many of the listings of National Historic Landmarks associated with literary figures. I assume the checks indicate that the reader had visited these places, and I almost want more interaction between former owner and text than there is here. There are quite a number of other interesting lists and points of trivia, and I can imagine that the book might be helpful when answering or constructing tag videos. Sadly, the listings in Bibliotopia stop in 2004. I would love to have a newly updated version. Have any of you heard of any other books like this one? Next, I picked up Paul Collins' memoir, Sixpence House, Lost in a Town of Books. The author and his wife moved from Northern California to Wales, specifically to that bookish mecca of Hay-on-Wye, where there are about 1,500 residents, but somewhere in the neighborhood of at least 40 bookstores. The back of the book says this is a meditation on what books mean to us, and the reviews printed in the first few pages makes it clear that this book is both funny and gentle. Exactly the kind of book I may want to read next week after I have to undergo a very minor dental procedure. Books, and perhaps especially books about books, can bring us comfort. On to the next one. My husband found this small little collection of short stories by A.S. Byatt. He's now already read them, but I haven't dipped in yet. It's called Elementals, Stories of Fire and Ice. I mentioned in my discussion with Steve that I adore Byatt's novel Possession. It's been a long time since I read it. I wonder if I can get my husband to reread it with me. I also really loved her novel, The Children's Year. But to be honest, I don't always love her short stories, at least not as much as her long novels. Just in general, I think I like short stories significantly more than many readers do. Perhaps because I grew up immersed in everything from folk tales to the short stories of Southern writers like Eudora Welty and Flannery O'Connor. But there's something about Byatt's writing that allows me to sink deeply into a particular atmosphere and mood, and I want to luxuriate in that world, not be jerked out of it at the end of a short story. Still, I'm eager to read some of Elementals, to hear what my spouse David thought of them as well. The next book is another volume that David found on the shelves, a fascinating picture book about Virginia Woolf, put together by Guillaume Leclerc and Isabelle Arsenault. I may have mispronounced their names. Neither is listed in that pronunciation guide printed in Bibliotopia. In this book, the narrator is Woolf's sister, Vanessa Bell. Virginia Woolf is Virginia Woolf, a little girl often in what the book calls a wolfish mood. Her sunny sister Vanessa seeks to cheer her up. Eventually, she creates a world for her, painting, quote, Bloomsbury on her walls, making, as she says, the place look just as it sounded. Just lovely. I've been a bit subsumed in Virginia Woolf lately because I just read Merve Imre's brand new annotated version of Mrs. Dalloway, which I wrote a fairly long piece on for the online journal On the Seawall. I think their next publication date is in 2 weeks, and I'll put up a link then. Reading the picture book was an excellent way to celebrate finishing that essay. But there was more Woolf to be found out in Brattle Say a Lot. The first 2 volumes of The Letters of Virginia Woolf, edited by Nigel Nicholson and Joanne Troutman. While I've read individual Woolf letters here and there, I've not read these complete versions. Part of me really wants to rush out and try to find decent and matching copies of the next 4 volumes of the 6-volume set of Woolf letters. Still, to be honest, I think I'm most excited to read the first volume. The first letter was written when Woolf was something like 6 years old, and the last, sometime right around the time she got married. During that period, she really began to think of herself or to construct herself as a writer. And that's a subject that has always fascinated me. In fact, I just wrote a piece on that very subject about a different author, the poet Elizabeth Barrett Browning, which was published in last week's edition of On the Seawall. I'll leave that link down below in the description box. Okay, on to a book that is not about Virginia Woolf, but I suppose has certain similarities. The selected letters of the novelist, poet, and journal writer May Sarton. The collection is edited by Susan Sherman, who had been a friend of Sarton's in the end of her life. The first letters in the collection are from Sarton's childhood. In fact, one of the early letters is a thank you to her parents for giving her books. And the letters continue into her middle age, but not her later years, talking about everything from the horrors of war in mid-century America to the joy of gardening and spending time in the presence of animals. I've loved Sarton since I was about 20 years old, reading and rereading her novels, and then later in my life, her journal memoirs. There's a simplicity and cleanness to her work, a plainness that feels rich at the same moment. I think that perspective is embodied by her statement that poetry is not an orchid, but a crocus. Her writing feels real and natural, not too heavily tinted, but blooming simply where it grew at the first sign of warmth. Like with the Woolf volumes, this seems to be only the first part of Sarton's letters, although it is luckily the first of only 2 volumes. And I'm definitely on the lookout for the 1955 to 1995 collection. Although I don't think I'll be able to get back to the Brattle Bookshop until at the very earliest October, I will be pawing through all the myriad little free libraries in my town and possibly going to the used bookstores in the DC area with that volume at the top of my list. Well, the next book is also about an author I've loved for a very long time. In fact, Steve teased me about reading Thomas Wolfe when I was younger. I guess it does sound like a bit of a strange choice, but actually, since Wolfe, this Wolfe, not Virginia Woolf, grew up in North Carolina, just as I did, he seemed almost like a local. And his novel Look Homeward, Angel is a Bildungsroman, the story of someone coming of age, and coming of age as a writer, which made it a perfect book for a young reader and writer in many ways. Although he is usually considered an example of a modernist writer, akin to Faulkner and James Joyce and John Dos Passos, the latter an author I still have not read, I find his work to be extremely accessible. What I picked up was not a copy of Look Homeward, Angel, though. Instead, it's a biography of Thomas Wolfe, called simply Look Homeward, by the historian David Herbert Donald. David Donald was my professor in a couple of Southern history classes, and although I've read a fair bit of his scholarship, I've never read this book. I have a vague memory that this book did not garner especially positive reviews back when it was published in the late 1980s, but I may be totally misremembering. Perhaps the reviews were about Wolfe's writing rather than David Donald's. As Steve pointed out, he hasn't been on a lot of people's reading lists for many years. Still, on the back of the book, there's a quote from Gore Vidal, with just about the most positive comment you could hope for. Quote, easily the best biography of an American novelist. I have 3 more books to talk about today, but this is the last one from the Brattle. Let me set the stage for you. When I first met Steve that morning and we were chatting in front of the carts before we started browsing for Real, I told Steve, who has been my mentor this past year and a half as I've started publishing book reviews, that one of his jobs for the day was to find a collection or 2 of book criticism or essays that he thought I should read. When I told him his job for the day, he immediately reached out his hand to the cart right in front of us and said, "How about this one?" It was this book, Penelope Fitzgerald's The Afterlife, Essays and Criticism, with an introduction by the great biographer Hermione Lee. Some of the essays are about classics, from Jane Austen's Emma to George Eliot's Middlemarch. Other pieces are about 20th century novels, many of which we now think of as classics, but which were more part of Fitzgerald's own world, authors like Barbara Penn, and also writers a bit later than that, like Amy Tan and Carol Shields. Some of the criticism I am most eager to read is of literary biographies, from A.N. Wilson's biography of C.S. Lewis to Richard Holmes' book on Coleridge. I'm not sure how much I've said on this channel, but one of my favorite subgenres of books to review are literary biographies, and I love to watch the pros do it too. Well, all these books somehow are high on my list. As usual, I really wish I could read as fast and as long as Steve Donahue does, just so I could get through more great books. And of course, on top of these Brattle books, I have 2 more from the Little Free Library. One is another collection of essays, or really just columns, I suppose, by the great Calvin Trillin. The book is called Too Soon to Tell, and the back cover specifically points out Trillin's barbed and irrepressible style, warning readers that if they read this book during their morning commutes, they might be forced to make a fool of themselves by snorting on the train. The essays appear to be about politics and religion and who invented golf and dog seatbelts, not books in general. But it should be a lot of fun to parcel these out when I need just a couple of pages to read here and there. And finally, a lovely copy of P. Djèlí Clark's 2020 work of speculative fiction, Ring Shout. This short novel is, as one reviewer said, a cross between Ralph Ellison's The Invisible Man and Buffy the Vampire Slayer. Its subtitle, Hunting Ku Kluxes in the End Times. In general, I'm not a fan of speculative fiction, but this particular book is about an historical issue and era that I'm engaged with academically, and I've heard great things about this book. When I checked out, despite the fact that I had with me not only an empty backpack, a tote bag folded inside it, and a husband next to me with his own empty backpack, the bookman behind the counter was kind enough to give me my very own Brattle book bag. Okay, so I guess to make this a real Brattle book haul, I need to make a, quote, steep pyramid. Let's try this out. First, we have a picture book about Virginia Woolf, complete with a lovely creation story for Bloomsbury. Next, there are 2 volumes of the 6-volume set of the Letters of Virginia Woolf, including the first few decades when Woolf first started defining herself or creating herself as a writer. Next, the first of 2 volumes of the letters of the wonderful American author May Sarton, and a biography of this Southern modernist Thomas Wolfe, written by the historian David Donald. And then 2 books of essays, the first by the novelist Penelope Fitzgerald, with a lot of bookish talk between the covers, and a second, a collection of less bookish and potentially more flippant prose by Calvin Trillin. And then a couple of works of fiction, the novel Ring Shout by P. Djèlí Clark, and a collection of short stories by A.S. Byatt called Elementals. And finally, a couple of bookish books. Sixpence House, a memoir about a family's move from California to the amazingly bookish Welsh towns of Hay on Wye. And then a collection of assorted literary trivia called Bibliotopia. Quite a haul. Now the trick is to find shelf space for all these new acquisitions. Thank you so much, Steve, for introducing me to the Brattle. I hope we can go again soon. And thanks to all of you for joining me here today as I sort through my new, or rather new to me, volumes. See you soon here on Hannah's Books.